Hello, and welcome to In the Crease, episode 62. I am your host, JE. Today, we're diving into one of the great mysteries of North American history, the disappearance of the Anasazi. Who were they? And how does an entire civilization seemingly vanish? Well, grab a seat, or if you wish, hang out on a cliff, if feeling adventurous, and let's explore a bit of this ancient whodunit. First off, let's start off with a quick note on the name Anasazi. It's actually from a Navajo word meaning enemy ancestors, which is admittedly kind of awkward name when you think about it. Can you imagine calling your great grandparents the enemy? Then again, my great great grandparents did fight for the South in the Civil War, so enough of that. Many of the descendants of this culture, the modern Pueblo peoples, understandably prefer the term ancestral Puebloans. But since Anasazi is the name most folks recognize, and, well, let's face it, it looks a little bit better on our title card, we'll use it here, with all respect to their ancestors. Just remember, when we say Anasazi tonight, we are talking about the forebears of today's Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo tribes. Now picture the Four Corners regions of the American Southwest, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet in a landscape of mesas, canyons, and desert scrub. This is your Anasazi country. Starting over 2,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Anasazi were living simple lives, farming maize, building small pit houses, and slowly mastering the art of survival in a very tough environment. And by tough, I mean seriously tough. This is the high desert, hot summers, cold winters, and rainfall about as predictable as a second lieutenant with a map. Periodic droughts, flash floods, and biting winds were all part of the package. The Anasazi depended on winter snow to melt and provide precious water for the crops each spring. A few bad snow years or, fickle summer rains, and you'd be in a real bit of trouble. Yet these people, they didn't just survive. They thrived and built one of the most remarkable cultures in the pre-Columbian America. By around 500 AD, we see the rise of village life. Over the next centuries, the Anasazi transitioned from pit houses to above-ground dwellings, and by roughly 900 AD, they were hitting their stride. Small settlements evolved into bustling villages and towns. If you time traveled, well, I kind of wrote part of this based on Jux's airing last night, but if you time traveled to the Pueblo II era, 900 to 1150 AD, you'd find a true golden age unfolding. In Chaco Canyon, northwestern New Mexico, something almost miraculous was happening. Massive stone cities were rising out of the desert floor. Anasazi builders quarried huge sandstone blocks and hauled timber from mountain dozens of miles away to construct 15 major complexes. And I know, Ordy is in chat. Thank you for being here. I know you tried. I just couldn't resist that time travel jab at you. But the 15 major complexes, these weren't just big for their time. They actually ranked among the largest buildings until modern steel frame skyscrapers came along in the 1800s. Think about that. For centuries, the title of largest apartment complex in North America was held by an 11th century Anasazi great house, not surpassed until the era of New York tenements. Not bad for a society without metal tools or, the wheel. It's kind of hard to overstate how impressive the canyon was around 1000 AD. Picture dusty brown mesas under a brilliant blue sky, and in the midst of that, multi-story buildings of carefully fitted stone rising 4 or 5 stories high. One of these complexes, called Pueblo Bonito, had over 600 rooms, including large circular ceremonial chambers known as kivas. In fact, many great houses averaged 200-plus rooms, with some even reaching 700. Essentially, they were prehistoric condos on a grand scale. Pueblo Bonito alone covered several acres and may have housed a few hundred people, with dozens of kivas and a plaza. At its foot loomed a cliff, and the settlement was laid out in D shape against it. The letter D, not the private part D shaped, almost like a giant amphitheater of stone. And it wasn't just the size, it's the planning that actually still wows archaeologists. The Anasazi engineers constructed vast sections of these great houses in single master plan building phases, meaning they weren't just adding a room here, adding a room there, as maybe was needed. They actually had a blueprint in mind, a vision for what was a monumental community center. And Chaco Canyon wasn't an isolated city either. It was more like a bustling capital of the Chacoan world. Rating out from Chaco, the Anasazi built a network of roads. Yes, yes, actual roads, and some being amazingly straight, linking dozens of outlying villages and great houses across 25,000 square miles of the Four Corners area. Now, they didn't have carts or horses, so these roads might have been more ceremonial or for foot traffic, but the point is, they were connected. Trade goods flowed into the hub, exotic items like macaw feathers from hundreds of miles to the south, seashells from the Pacific coast, and tons of turquoise. Archaeologists even found cocoa residue in some jars. It actually turns out that the Anasazi elite might have been a little bit of chocoholics, and let's face it, can we blame them? All these non-local luxuries prove the Anasazi trade was far and wide. Now remember, we're talking a pre-GPS, pre-horse civilization moving goods across deserts and mountains through pure human endurance and know-how. The elite living in those big houses dined off fancy ceramics, wore turquoise jewelry, and were like political or spiritual leaders hosting ceremonies in these great kivas. They had even aligned some buildings with celestial events. For instance, the famous sun dagger petroglyph on Fiata Butte and Chaco that marks the solstices with a beam of light. Now, it had to have taken generations of skywatching and careful planning to align their architecture to suns and moon cycles, hinting at a maybe more sophisticated grasp of astronomy than we give them credit for. So, if you're imagining the Anasazi as just scattered, primitive farmers, you might want to rethink that. At their height, they had an organized society capable of massive projects and even scientific observation. But today's episode isn't titled The Flourishing of the Anasazi. No, no. Oh, how I wish it was. It's about their disappearance. By the 1200s, many of the great houses and vibrant communities were abandoned. Visitors to places like Pueblo Bonito or Mesa Verde today often ask, what happened here? Why did they leave? It's been called one of the greatest of history's mysteries. Now, I'm going to let you in on something a little early. The Anasazi didn't just all drop dead or, get beamed up by aliens. We'll get to the ancient aliens part of the show later. Don't worry. In reality, their descendants are still around, and they'll tell you straight up, the people didn't vanish. They moved. But the way they moved, the reasons they moved, and the abruptness of it all does feel mysterious, almost eerie. Imagine thriving towns and sacred sites occupied for centuries suddenly left silent. Whole cliff cities emptied out within a generation. For a long time, scientists scratched their heads, and even now, they're still piecing together clues. And that's what we're going to kind of delve into. The evidence left in the ground, well, and in the tree rings and in the bones. And let's admit it here, some of it is going to get pretty gruesome. And the theories, both sensible and some far-fetched, that people have actually proposed to explain why the Anasazi had an exodus. Now, we're going to break this story into 4 segments. First, we're setting the stage with who they were and where and when the world they built, which is this segment. And next, we're going to talk about the signs of trouble, how a golden age did turn dark. And then after that, we'll have a wonderful little intermission of about 4.5 minutes. So if you're thirsty or want a snack, don't worry, we'll give you a long break for that. So let's jump in to the segment number 2. So here we are at the height of Anasazi civilization and the beginning of its troubles. When we left off, they were living in large, great houses, far-flung trade, all the good stuff. But no empire, or proto-empire in this case, lasts forever. By the mid 1100s, things were starting to change. If you were an Anasazi elder in 1150, you might have felt a chill of uncertainty in that desert air. The climate, once your ally during Chaka's rise, has started to turn on you, and distant drumbeats of conflict were echoing in the horizon. One big turning point was around 1130 AD. Tree ring data, and there's a whole science of reading ancient tree rings called dendrochronology. I almost said that right. Give me credit for that. Shows a massive drought struck the Southwest during the 1130s, and it lasted nearly 50 years. So 5 decades of intermittent rainfall failure. Chaco Canyon, which had boomed in a period of decent rainfall, suddenly faced chronic water shortages. Crops would wither, reservoirs would dry up, and when you're hauling every drop of water from sparse seeps and snowmelt, a long drought, let's face it, is catastrophic. Archaeologists believe this mega drought was the reason the Chacoans abandoned the canyon after roughly 1150 AD. Now imagine the monumental great houses of Chaco, once the center of life, just slowly emptying out. Roofs would be stripped for timbers, sacred kivas left to the mice and the dust. It had to have been heartbreaking. But, at least on one side, they didn't have any more HOA fees that, they needed to pay and make sure nothing was in their front yard. So not everything was necessarily bad. But where did the people go after Chaco fell? Well, they didn't give up on life. They migrated. Many likely moved northward into what is now Mesa Verde region, southwestern Colorado, and other areas with higher elevations that got more rain. New cultural centers appeared. Mesa Verde, you've probably seen pictures of the stunning cliff palaces. It became a hotspot in the late 12th century. Interestingly, the people in Mesa Verde and other areas started building their homes differently. Instead of open plazas and accessible ground level villages like Chaco, around the 1200s they began carving dwellings high in cliff alcoves or positioning villages on mesa tops with steep drop-offs. So why the change? I mean, okay, the location screams defense. A cliff dwelling like Cliff Palace is tucked under a rock overhang on the side of a canyon wall. Basically, you'd have to climb hand and toe to reach it, or use a ladder that lets, honestly, the villagers could just pull up behind them and knock them over. It's the medieval equivalent of living in a fortress on a cliff. In fact, archaeologists say the Anasazi were driven to these defensible positions by increasing competition and conflict amidst the changing climatic conditions. Or in plainer terms, resources were getting more scarce, because drought will do that, and neighbors might not have been so neighborly anymore. The once relatively peaceful Anasazi world had become a more dangerous place to live. So let's talk about Mesa Verde's Cliff Palace, the poster child of cliff dwellings. Built around 1200 AD, Cliff Palace is an awe-inspiring complex of about 150 rooms and 23 kivas, all tucked into a huge sandstone alcove halfway up a canyon. It might have housed roughly 100 people. There's still some debate on that, and it's clear it wasn't easy to get in or even out. One side is a sheer cliff. The overhang shelters it above. Now, the Anasazi here had turned into living inaccessible on purpose. Why? Once again, one archaeologist would put it, increasing competition, and which is a nice way of saying they were likely getting raided and there was warfare in the area. And if you're farming maize on the mesa tops and every harvest counts, a few armed raiders stealing your corn could be the difference between life and starvation. Anyone who's playing Minecraft can tell you this. How do you protect your family? You literally move under a rock. It's kind of like saying, come at me, bro, if you can climb, a 100-foot vertical wall first with me throwing things at you. Now, the move to cliff dwellings in the high mesas were part of a broader trend in the late 1200s. Across the Anasazi homeland, many communities relocated to more defensible, water-accessible spots. You will see small farmsteads clustered into larger villages on hilltops, often with some sort of protective wall. At Arizona's Cayente region, for example, villages had been in open canyons moved up into high, narrow mesas around this time. Archaeologist Jonathan Haas studied some of these sites and concluded that people weren't moving just for the view, they were moving for safety. These mesa village tops have learned they had the high ground, something Obi-Wan Kenobi would be very, very proud of. But they were far from water and fields. So why accept that inconvenience? Because there was strength in height and numbers. Haas suggests these isolated communities were on guard against enemies, and that raiding and warfare were becoming all too common in the 13th century, here and elsewhere. Now, who were these enemies? Sometimes other Anasazi groups, desperate times, can pit kin against kin, but there were also new kids on the block. The late 1200s in the Southwest saw an influx of outsiders moving into the region. Numic-speaking peoples, ancestral Utes, Shoshones, Paiutes, expanding out to what's now California. And the Dene were migrating from the north. Those Dene would later be known as the Navajo and Apache. Now, we have to be a little careful here. It's not like a Game of Thrones horde sweeping in all at once. But evidence suggests that as these new groups arrived, competition for the resources just simply intensified. The well-established Anasazi farming villages suddenly had nomadic or even semi-nomadic newcomers, eyeing the same game animals and water sources. Combine that with a string of, poor rainfall years, and you kind of have a bottle powder keg. I'm going to adjust something here real quick for you. Okay, there we go. Meanwhile, even before the outsiders showed up, the Anasazi heartland was hitting the ecological limits of what it could actually support. Take Chaco Canyon. Remember all these trees they hauled in for beams? Well, they pretty much clear-cut the nearby forest by the 1100s. And as villages grew, so did the demand for wood, for construction, for fire, for warmth, and for arable land and wild game. By the 1200s, many areas were ecologically stressed. One theory holds that the Anasazi effectively exhausted their environment, leading to deforestation and declining productivity, which in turn would spark conflict, basically fighting over a pie that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's kind of like a very slow motion train wreck. Climate stress plus human pressure equals boom. But let's put ourselves in the sandals of an Anasazi villager around 1270 AD. Say you live in one of these cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde. You've seen your parents talk about how things weren't always this precarious. Grandma remembers when the rains were reliable and the storage rooms were full of corn. Now, each year, you worry if the crops will fail. You've heard rumors that a village a day's walk away was burned, maybe by strangers or maybe by feuding cousins. No one is sure. At night, the Kiva ceremonies to pray for rain have an added prayer. For protection. You post lookouts on the mesa edge. You perhaps even seen violence up close. Desperate times can really do ugly things to people. Well, the question becomes, how ugly? Well, archaeologists found a stark example at a small site called Cowboy Wash in today's southwestern Colorado. There, in a pit house, they uncovered the remains of at least 24 people who met a very gruesome fate. These skeletons, dating to the late 1200s, show signs of violent death and even dismemberment. Cut marks on bones, skulls cracked open. The evidence strongly suggests cannibalism. Yep, you heard that right. Those peace-loving Indians were cannibals. It appears some Anasazi were butchering and possibly eating other humans. Now, before anyone imagines a southwestern Hannibal Lecter, let's put this a little bit in context. This could have technically been survival cannibalism, and here we thought the Donner Party was the first one. People starving during a famine will do some very unthinkable things. Or perhaps this is just a result of warfare. victors terrifying their foes with a bit of, I just ate Frank. What are you going to do about it? Really good psychological warfare. Some researchers even propose it could have had a ritual aspect or been done by outside invaders to scare the inhabitants away. The truth is, no one knows the exact motive. But we do know it was a very exceptionally bad day in Cowboy Wash. The site was abandoned immediately afterwards, whether because the survivors fled in horror or that there was simply no one left to flee. We're not sure. And that said, Cowboy Wash isn't an isolated case. There have been other sites with unburied, mangled remains from this period. It really does paint a chilling picture of just how dire things can turn toward the end. Now, I realize this did take a very unexpected dark turn, and you might be thinking, Jeff, I tuned in for a history mystery, not Cannibal Corpse 2080 AD tour. I get it. But these grim clues are part of the archaeological detective story, one that Aggie would be proud of if she was here. They tell us that that by the final decades of the 13th century, social order was breaking down in some areas. Hunger, fear, and violence were likely commonplace in the worst-hit regions. In a way, it's a testament to how stress-tested the Anasazi were by then. Drought after drought, failing crops, increasing conflict. The center could not hold. Now, once again, speaking of droughts, we talked about the 1130s drought that week in Chaco. Unfortunately, that wasn't the last big thirsty spell. Paleoclimate records, like tree rings from ancient pines, indicate another series of mega droughts in the late 1200s. One particular infamous drought began around 1276 and lasted roughly 23 years to 1299, once dubbed the Great Drought. Imagine being born in 1260, and by the time you're hitting midlife, you've never known a truly good harvest year. Just unrelentless dryness with a few wet reprieves that didn't last. If there was any hope of clinging on in the cliff villages and mesa villages, that great drought pretty much sealed that deal. With food production systems constantly disrupted, even the well-defended cliffside villages could not last. By 1300 AD, virtually all the Anasazi settlements in the Four Corners region, including Cliff Palace and its neighbors in Mesa Verde, was abandoned. The exodus was essentially complete. So we've walked through the Anasazi Golden Age and into the Gathering Storm. First, we had a drought-driven move from one canyon to the next, the rising conflict and defensive strategies, and finally that 1-2 punch of warfare and more mega droughts that brought their world basically to the tipping point. It's a bit like watching a slow collapse of a house of cards, except these were with people's lives. Now, we've gotten to the point where it's time to step out of the kiva for a moment and catch our breath. We've already been through a lot, and we've only been on the air for 25 minutes. We've had bustling great houses, perilous cliff dwellings, a dash of cannibalistic madness. If this was a movie, now would be when the lights come up for a few minutes so you can process and refill your popcorn, or, maybe your Navajo Nation water canteen. Hey, it's not a real sponsor, but I'm open to any sponsors that would like to reach out to me. So just remember, on a lighter note, the Anasazi did leave behind some really amazing art. Petroglyphs and pictographs on rock walls. Some are handprints, some are animals or spirals. And I like to think maybe one of those handprints was kind of a ancient prank, like, tag, I was here. Even 1,000 years ago, people had a sense of humor. Maybe somewhere on a cliff is the equivalent of a smiley face or, dick pics. They're there. There has to be at least one, right? And speaking of humor, let's address the giant extraterrestrial in the room. And no, I'm not talking about me. Ancient aliens. That TV show where very unexplained things in history is attributed to little green men. You just know these guys couldn't resist the Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Inhabitants mysteriously vanished. Advanced knowledge of astronomy? Could it be, aliens? But I'll give them a point for entertainment, if not necessarily for accuracy. Ancient astronaut theorists have entered the chat, folks, and we'll deal with them soon enough with a bit of healthy dose of skepticism and sass. But with that, I'm going to refill my beer and prepare for the next half of the show. In a moment, we'll return to 13th century America, where the stage is set for the climax of our story, the Great Disappearance. We'll answer the question, what became of them? What are left of those cliff cities and great houses? Did they hitch a ride on a UFO? And if they did, why did they not send me any postcards? So stretch your legs, imagine you're scaling a ladder to a cliff house for the view, and join me back here for segment 3 in about 4.5 minutes. We will be right back.
Footsteps fade in sandstone dusk, echoes left in woven dust. We carved our names in nothingness, then let the wind decide. I wove you from thread and thunder, fed your sky from my trembling hands. Now you're chasing clouds down canyons where I cannot walk or stand. Your eyes held fires I never lit, your silence spoke in shifting stone. And when the drum beat stopped at dusk, you followed it alone. Gone but not vanished, hidden not lost. The path winds inward, then outward again. A breath held in frost. The sunset's different now, still I keep the door ajar, listening for that gentle footfall that left with no North Star. I left a bowl for your return, but shadows drank it dry. The song you hum now haunts the cliffs where feathered spirits fly. Were you taken by a starlit veil, or did you walk beyond the ridge? I asked the elders, asked the bones, they only blinked beneath the bridge. Some vanished to be remembered, some stay to be forgot. You whispered once the wind would teach, now that's all I've got. Gone but becoming, ash into flight. You left no trace, and yet I'm filled with fragments of your light. The stories never end, they just stop midline. So I finish them in dreams and pretend they're mine. succeed. They say abandoned, but you are freed.
And welcome back to In the Crease. Hope you enjoyed that music. When we left off, the year was around 1300 AD, and the Anasazi heartland had effectively emptied out. Now it's time to answer that burning question. Where the hell did everyone go? And this following segment is all about the aftermath, the exit itself, and the evidence we have for why it happened. We've hinted at the big factors, drought, war, and resource stress, but now let's piece them together and follow the people as they journey to their new homes. And just for those listening, you would enjoy the fact that I got a phone call from Aggie during the intermission. Now, first, let's correct the old myth. The Anasazi did not just vanish in the thin air. This isn't the Roanoke colony, which I hope Juxtaposition will do another episode on, now that they're going 2 hours when they are able to air, with its mysterious lost English settlers. In the case of the Anasazi, we can actually track their movements through both archaeological and oral histories. When the rains failed and the conflicts mounted, the Anasazi migrated to areas in the southwest with more reliable water. Basically, they voted with their feet and said, Mesa Verde, it's been real, but we got to go where the river flows. Many moved south and east, closer to the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico and the Little Colorado River in Arizona, regions that, while not exactly lush, had more dependable streams and springs than the drought-stricken Four Corners did. Some went west towards the Hopi mesas in Arizona. Others south into what's now New Mexico. And if you look at a map, you'll notice modern Pueblo villages, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, Zia, Taos, etc., are mostly on the periphery of the old Anasazi lands. This isn't a coincidence. These are the places where water was available year-round. Think rivers or even high-elevation water tables. Or just where the Anasazi refugees found refuge. And the archaeological evidence backs this up. In the 14th century, we see new villages springing up in these areas, and the pottery styles, architecture, and other facts show continuity with the Anasazi culture, with perhaps a few tweaks here and there. It's basically like they packed their U-Hauls, or, their turkeys and dogs carrying baskets, since those were their beast of burdens, and just simply relocated, merging with or setting up communities in these better watered locales. For instance, by about 1325, there were large Pueblo towns in the Rio Grande and New Mexico, some with hundreds of rooms, where before there had been none. Something clearly changed after 1300. People flooded into these regions. And who were those people? Well, by and large, the Anasazi, now become the ancestral Pueblo of the new area. So let's bring in the voices of the descendants themselves. Pueblo oral history is rich with stories of migration. Many Pueblo people today, the Hopi, Zuni, Karas, Tuyua, have traditions about coming from somewhere else. The Hopi, for example, speak of journeys through different worlds and lands before settling on the mesas where they live now. The San Ildefonso people in New Mexico specifically believe that their ancestors used to live up north in the Mesa Verde region and also in the canyons of Bandelier before moving to the Rio Grande area. These stories were told long before archaeologists ever came along. They're not about droughts and wars per se. They're often couched in, more spiritual terms. But they essentially say our ancestors came from those ancient ruins out west. So when early 20th century anthropologists started asking, hey, what happened to the folks who built all these wonderful, amazing cliff palaces? Pueblo elders were like, dude, we are what happened. We're still here. We just moved our band down alongside the river. And they kind of have a point. Most modern Pueblo peoples assert that the Anasazi did not vanish at all. They just simply migrated and became the famous and various Pueblo nations that the Spanish encountered in the 1500s. Now, from a scientific perspective, this absolutely makes perfect sense. It's not like tens of thousands of people can just die off without leaving a trace. There's always a trace. Sure, some may have perished in famines or fighting, but most probably saw the writing on the wall and moved out before things got fatal. And it might not even have been a single coordinated evacuation. No one sent out a mass flyer saying, hey, by 1290, everyone meet at the canyon exit. But gradually, over a few decades, family by family and village by village, the population moved. One year, you help your neighbors build a new grain storage in your cliff dwelling. A couple years later, you're patching the roof less, maybe not planting the upper field. Then you hear your cousin left last spring to join distant relatives near a river. And finally, you say, fuck it. Next summer, if the corn fails, we're headed there too. In an oddly relatable way, it's not unlike modern people leaving a drought-stricken rural town for a city with jobs and water. It's a tough decision, but survival dictates change. The final generation of the Anasazi and their original homeland must have been bittersweet. Imagine being a teenager in, say, 1285 in a cliff dwelling. By 1290, half your village is gone, left for supposed greener pastures. By 1295, you're one of the last holdouts, and each evening your parents are having a debate. Do we stay or do we go? You've got ancestors buried here, sacred sites all around, and the very identity of your people is tied to the land. But your little siblings are hungry, and your parents are worried. Ultimately, perhaps guided by spiritual signs or sheer pragmatism, they finally decide to join the migration. You gather what you can carry, tools, precious pottery, maybe a ceremonial mask or two, and you walk away. You climb down that cliff ladder, perhaps for the final time, and you do not look back. It's a somber trek. Maybe some elderly folk couldn't make the journey, maybe some die en route. But eventually you reach a place where the river is still flowing and the corn can still grow. There you meet other bands of migrants. They speak dialects you most likely understand. After all, they were your neighbors a decade ago. Together you merge and form a new village, bigger than any you lived in before. You build plaza-centric pueblos and receive your ceremonies to bless this new start. Life goes on, but in a different key. Now one has to ask, how can we be sure these new Pueblo communities were the Anasazi and not some other group? Maybe it was another group and some Anasazi, or maybe there was none Anasazi at all. Well, archaeologists gives us some connecting threads. In particular, the style of pottery. Right around 1300, a distinct type of pottery known as Saladeo polychrome appears in the Southwest, blending influences from different regions. It's kind of like a material signature of formerly distant groups coming together sharing styles. Also, certain kiva designs and clan symbols and rock arts continue from the old sites to the new. And as mentioned, the Pueblo peoples themselves kept songs, dances, and stories that reference these old places. To this day, some Pueblo families have rituals to honor places like Chaco and Mesa Verde as part of their heritage. Now, we have to acknowledge also that not every single person left. Some areas, particularly on the very fringes, might have kept small groups for longer. And culturally, some Anasazi groups had already diverged. For instance, the Hohokam in south and southern Arizona and the Mongolan in southern New Mexico were distant cultures related to the ancestral Pueblans, and they too underwent changes or collapse around the 1400s, likely influenced by this same climatic downturn. The Hohokam, famous for their Phoenix area canals, faced floods and droughts, and by 1450 their big towns were gone. It was a region-wide shakeup. So the disappearance of the Anasazi wasn't necessarily one event, but was a larger series of processes, a migration and cultural transformation. By 1350, the Four Corners region went quiet. The great houses falled into ruin. Wind blew sand over abandoned fields, and critters scurried through empty rooms that once echoed with prayer songs and children's laughter. But far to the south and east, along the Rio Grande and the Mongolian Rim and the Hopi mesas, the descendants were laying new roots. They were the genesis of the Pueblo societies that would later greet Spanish explorers in the 16th century with ears of corn and turkey feather blankets, and probably a healthy skepticism of these odd European-looking people. Interestingly, when the Spanish did arrive around 1540 and met the Pueblo peoples, those Pueblos had memories of migrations and upheavals, but they'd been settled in their new homes for about 250 years by then, which, is as long as the United States basically has existed today, give or take 25 years. So, from their perspective, the old times were really, really old, and life had moved on. Early Spaniards noted ruins in the landscape and asked the Pueblans about them, and the Pueblans basically said, "Those are the houses of our ancestors. We don't live there anymore." One Spanish soldier in 1540 wrote about seeing massive ancient ruins, quite possibly Chaco or similar, and being amazed. Little did he know the people giving him directions to the next water source were the very heirs of those abandoned cities. So let's sum up the key causes of the Anasazi exodus that the evidence points to. Climate change. In this case, just drought. When people use the word climate change now, everyone goes, "Oh, this was just the climate changed," as it does on its own. With the prolonged droughts, notably the one starting around 1276, leading to crop failures and unstable conditions, the corn agriculture that was the foundation of Anasazi life basically disappeared when the rains left, so the people did too. You have resource depletion. After centuries of population growth, local resources, tree, game, and perhaps most importantly, fertile soil were overused in some corn areas. Chaco forests, for example, never fully recovered from the logging. Less resources meant people had to move or face starvation. Conflict and warfare. Evidence of violence. We have burned villages, skeletal trauma, and defensive posturing with the cliff dwellings and palisades, showing that the 1200s were a time of unrest. Whether it was intersign warfare among Anasazi factions, raided by newcomers, or perhaps Orty's favorite thing, embrace the power of, and here, the fear of attack was a real push factor. If staying in our homes meant risking being killed or abducted, you'd strongly consider moving. Now, some anthropologists suggest there could have been a loss of faith in leadership or religion, something we really hadn't talked about yet. If the priests or chiefs couldn't bring the rain or stability, maybe people just decided to break away. There's an intriguing, though highly speculative, line of thought that the Anasazi deliberately dismantled their ceremony structures during the migration because they felt something had gone spiritually wrong, essentially a ritual closing of one chapter to start anew. Pueblo oral lore hints that the people might have thought their misuse of spiritual powers contributed to the imbalance of nature, and they needed to abandon or even destroy the old ritual spaces to set things right. Now, once again, take this with a bit of a grain of salt. It's hard to interpret, and they're still working on this theory today. And you have external pressures. As mentioned, groups like the Navajo and Utes entered the region, and it could have exacerbated the situation. It's not that these groups caused the Anasazi to disappear. They were probably just one factor among many. Opportunistically moving into the Anasazi were forced to move out, kind of like a tag team migration, one peaceful Indian group to another. That said, one thing to kind of really emphasize is I don't think there was a single villain in the story, not a singular war, one bad king, or anything like that. It was more a confluence of natural and human stresses. If the climate had nosedived, maybe the Anasazi could have managed the social stresses. If there hadn't been social strife, maybe they could have hung on through the drought. But both? Well, that combo was lethal to their way of life in the Four Corners. By 1300, the Anasazi, as we define them archaeologically, ceased to exist in the record of that region, but they do reappear as something new in new locales. In a way, it's kind of like a company that rebrands and relocates its headquarters. The old office sits empty, but the business is still running elsewhere under a new name. The Anasazi became the Pueblo peoples. Culturally, things shifted, new languages evolved, new religious practices were formed, like the Kachina cult among the Rio Grande Pueblos. That took hold in the 14th century, possibly as a way to cope with and understand the hardships their ancestors went through. But many core traditions ended up surviving. So before we move into the final segment, where we'll entertain some of the more creative theories and then wrap up the show, let's address one more archaeological finding that adds a poignant book into this story. At a site called Sacred Ridge near Durango, Colorado, excavations, revealed a brutal scene. Multiple individuals who had been massacred and mutilated around the late 17 or early 1800s AD, earlier than the final exodus, but illustrative of conflict. Some researchers, Potter and Chupaca, argued it might have been an instance of ethnic cleansing or social purging, essentially one group completely annihilating a community. While that event was earlier, it shows that conflict and the very extreme violence were not unheard of in Anasazi history. Now, the reason I mention this is to underscore that the Anasazi world was not an unchanged Eden of harmony. It had political intrigue, factions, and possibly oppressed minorities. When resources got tight, those simmering tensions could and often would explode. People often romanticize ancient cultures, but they were human societies with all the messiness that entails of being human. So the end might have been as much about internal social fractures as about external pressures or even the lack of rain. And in any case, by the time the dust settled, literally, yes, Ron, literally, the ancestral lands of the Anasazi were largely empty. Nature began to reclaim the terraces and roads. The disappearance was really a relocation and cultural metamorphosis. The people survived, but in a different form and place. So as we prepare to look at some of the more speculative interpretations of the Anasazi disappearance, let's keep in mind Occam's razor. The simplest explanation or explanations, drought, resource stress, and conflict leading to migration, is usually the right one. But let's face it, humans, they love a mystery. They love to fill in gaps with imagination. And boy, have there been some imaginative theories about the Anasazi. So let's have a little fun, shall we? So we're going to let down our hair a little bit and explore the speculative side of the Anasazi disappearance. Now, I think I've covered the scientific consensus fairly well. You'll be the judge of that, but hopefully I have. But no epic mystery is complete without some very wild theories. The Anasazi migrations have inspired everything from spiritual explanations to alien abduction stories. So we're going to talk about a few of them with respect, where due, and with humor, where due, and then bring it home with our closing thoughts, shall we? Theory 1. They were taken by aliens not of Alpha Centauri. Yes, as promised, here we go. The ancient aliens hypothesis of the Anasazi usually hinges on the idea that their accomplishments, such as big buildings, astronomically alignments, were too advanced for primitive people. So cue the extraterrestrials. Perhaps aliens helped them build and then whisked them away for some unknown reason. Maybe the Anasazi were extraterrestrials themselves stranded on Earth who finally picked up the phone and went, E.T. phone home. Maybe, or maybe they just got an Uber spaceship picked up around 1300s. Who knows? Now, if you've ever seen the meme of the guy with the crazy hair saying, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens, we all know his name, you know this line of thought. Certainly it's entertaining, but in this case, there's zero evidence for any of it. All the achievements of the Anasazi can be explained by human ingenuity. There's no Martian masonry needed, and their disappearance doesn't literally mean they disappeared off the face of the earth. They just moved to a safer zip code. That said, still, the image of a UFO hovering over Cliff Palace, beaming up people and pottery, makes for some fun B movie type stuff. And we can chuckle, but also acknowledge something. These alien theories often, perhaps unintentionally, do a disservice by suggesting native people couldn't possibly engineer such feats or make tough decisions. There's plenty of ancient alien stuff that could be more doubtful. This is not one of them. So, ancient alien dudes, thanks for the laugh, but we're going to file the ancient alien theory on at least regards to the people of the Anasazi. Highly unlikely. We do have another interesting theory, too. A single catastrophic event. Now, some have wondered and proposed if one huge calamity did the Anasazi in, like a supervolcano or even an earthquake. Let's face it, the Southwest is seismically active. That said, there's been no sign of a region-wide quake leveling sites around 1300. No volcano eruptions either. Certainly nothing like wiping out populations. So, what about disease? Could an epidemic or pandemic have swept through? Possibly. But we lack evidence like mass grave epidemics or clear pathogen signs and remains, and the few sites with more than a handful of people show warfare. Disease alone wouldn't cause people to systematically relocate to better watered areas. That response fits drought and hunger way better. So while an apocalyptic style disaster is kind of a neat narrative and not necessarily out of range of possibility that people started getting sick, the archaeological records suggest a drawn out struggle, not an overnight cataclysm. Theory 3. They became something more, a spiritual transformation. Here we enter the mystical realm and touching on maybe some alien stuff again. There are suggestions, and some from Pueblo lore, some from New Age thinkers, that maybe the Anasazi underwent a sort of mass spiritual migration, that they simply transcended into another plane of existence or went underground to live in Sipapu, or place of emergence. The Hopi, for instance, have stories of emerging from earlier worlds through Sipapus, and the Kachinas, spirit beings guiding them away. A very poetic notion is that perhaps the Anasazi didn't just walk to new villages, maybe they ritually closed one world and opened a new one. This ties to what I mentioned about possibly dismantling kivas and shrines deliberately. Not necessarily aliens, but maybe more of a spiritual rebirth. Some have even linked it to the legendary migrations in the book of Exodus or other cultural sagas, a chosen people journeying to a promised land under divine guidance, leaving behind a sinful and spent land. Now, as a amateur historian, I view this as metaphorical. They physically moved, but the way they understood it could have been well through a spiritual lens. They might have believed the gods or spirits ordained the move. So in a subtle way, this isn't incompatible with the actual facts in the case. It's just the interpretation of these causes in the minds of the people. Drought could be seen as the world telling them to move on, for instance. And I admittedly do find this angle fascinating because it reminds us that real people lived this experience and they had to make sense of it somehow. They didn't have climate science. They had prayers and omens. If the sun turns scorching and the rain stops, you might conclude that the rain gods became angry, or that you need to go find the place of the rising sun foretold in the dream. Thus, the spiritual transformation theory has a bit of kernel of truth in how the migration might have been viewed by the Anasazis themselves, even if materially it was about finding water and peace. Theory 4. Mass violence or genocide by invaders. Now, some have posited that many invading forces, maybe the Toltecs, the Aztecs from Mexico, or local nomads, swept in and basically killed or drove them out. There was an older idea that perhaps the Toltec or Aztec Empire might have extended a hand up north that doesn't simply hold water, though. Mesoamerica influence on the Anasazi was limited to trade of goods and maybe ideas. No Aztec army marched into Utah, as far as anyone can currently tell. As for genocide by nomads, the evidence doesn't show an entirely external conquest. Admittedly, we do see violent episodes, but if an outside tribe had wiped out the Anasazi, you'd expect to see that tribe occupying those sites afterward, or at least some clear signature of a new cultural group sitting on top of the ruins. Instead, we see the sites mostly empty out. It looks more like flight than fight. Invaders might have been one pressure, though, as we discussed, but not a one-sided slaughter scenario. If it were, the story would likely have been preserved by the victors, and the Pueblo peoples didn't recount, and then the Navajo slew us all. In fact, Navajo oral history paints the Pueblo as sometimes hostile to them, so it was a bit of a complex dynamic. Now, I wrote this next section thinking I was going to be following a certain show tonight that apparently I am the only show on the network this entire weekend. So I decided to write a bit of a Stargate SG-1 reference for the history nerds tonight. There's an episode of Stargate SG-1 for the uninitiated, a sci-fi show where humans find ancient portal to other worlds, where an advanced ancient culture ascends to a higher plane or something. It's been a while, but the idea of people physically disappearing because they became energy brings us beings or went through a portal is, right now, pure science fiction. But I can't help joking that if the Anasazi had found a Stargate in Chaco Canyon, it would have explained a lot. Chevron 7 lock. Next up, a planet with reliable rainfall. Maybe Colonel O'Neill showed up and said, folks, your relocation program awaits. But in all seriousness, no, the Anasazi story doesn't need wormholes or even ascension. The reality is compelling enough. It's a story of human resilience and adaptation to Mother Nature's violent mood swings. And I know I want to highlight something because I do know the phrase the disappearance of the Anasazi can actually rub some people the wrong way, particularly the descendants. Because from their point of view, nothing disappeared. Their ancestors simply changed address and kept living. Thank you very much. The narrative of a lost civilization can sometimes ignore the very much alive civilization that followed. The Hopi, Zuni, and the other Pueblo communities today treasure their connection to the ancestral Pueblo sites. They consider places like Chaco and Mesa Verde as part of their heritage. In recent years, archaeologists and native communities have worked together more closely to understand the past in a holistic way. Scientific findings about drought and migration mesh with oral traditions about seeking the center place or following spiritual guidance to a new home. It's kind of a beautiful convergence of science and tradition. So as we wrap up, let's recap the journey in plain terms. Over the course of about 700 years, 600 to 1300 AD, the Anasazi went from small pit house hamlets to building some of the largest stone complexes in the New World, to facing environmental and social crises that forced them to abandon their magnificent towns. They didn't vanish abruptly or mysteriously, as the spooky headlines often claim. Rather, they reorganized. They showed flexibility in the face of adversity, migrating, collaborating with new neighbors, innovating new social and religious structures. The Pueblo world that the Spanish stepped into in the 1500s with its pueblos like Taos, multi-story complexes, Kachini dances, and the networks of corn farmers, was a direct continuation of the Anasazi story. The next chapter after the quote-unquote disappearance. And in fact, one could argue the Anasazi never disappeared at all. They just changed their names for legal reasons. It's like saying the British disappeared in 1776 here in America. No, they just became Americans. Well, some of them. They moved on under a new identity. Similarly, the Anasazi became the Pueblos. What have we learned from the tale of the Anasazi? Oh, I think many things. We learned that climate change can profoundly affect societies when technology isn't there to help them. We learned that people can adore and adapt. They can pick up and start anew when the world falls apart. We also learned that interpreting the past is a bit of detective work. Things like tree rings, bones, pottery, linguistics, and legends all come together to give us the full picture. And yes, we learned that sometimes folks will prefer an alien kidnapping theory over, a complex, less glamorous truth. But hey, that's kind of human nature too. We all love a fantastical story. And before I sign off for the night, let me leave you with an image. Today, if you visit, say, Canyon de Chile in Arizona or Bandelier in New Mexico, you might see ruins of cliff dwellings and pueblos with no one living in them. But if you listen to the wind, you might hear something else, the sounds of a living culture. Because in those same areas, Navajo sheep herders and Pueblo farmers carry on, living different lifestyles but spiritually tied to this land. A Navajo guide might show you a cliff ruin and then take you to meet her grandmother who still weaves traditional blankets nearby. A Hopi elder might point to the rock art left by his ancestors on a mesa that his family had lived on for centuries since. The spirit of the Anasazi is all around, not gone, just transformed. In a way, the disappearance is actually a story of survival. And that's the story, or rather, the epic saga of the so-called disappearance of the Anasazi. From grandeur to hardship to renewal, it's a tale as dramatic as any in the world history, yet deeply rooted in the soil of the American Southwest. I hope you enjoyed this journey through time. I know we went a little over, but hey, Al's not following us. Hope your internet gets fixed, Al. But I do believe the Anasazi deserve this level of detail. They gave us 700 years of drama, after all. And if you've ever been in the Four Corners area, take some time to visit these ancient sites. Stand in a room at Pueblo Bonito and imagine laughter echoing off the plaster walls. Walk through Cliff Palace and picture kids peeking out the doorways 1,000 years ago. These places aren't just stones. They're storytelling corners where the past can whisper to us all. Thank you for listening to this episode of In the Crease. I am JEFF, your guide through history's twists and turns. Until next time, when we talk the murders of the Hinterkaifex, remember, history may not repeat, but it sure as hell does rhyme a lot. And sometimes it leaves behind one heck of a mystery to solve. So stay curious, stay respectful, and most importantly, watch out for those mega droughts.